Good afternoon. Now, somebody has been hearing tapes before. It's a wonderful experience to greet so many of you here. And more especially since it is my first visit to Grand Rapids since many centuries ago. But very first visit in this work, and of course, until we come here, it is impossible to know how deep the interest is in the message. And of course, your being here tells me a lot more than any other thing could possibly do. It is an interesting experience traveling this world and watching the unfoldment of the infinite way. More especially when you remember that it is only about 14 years ago that the first Infinite Way book was published. And since then, probably 25 have been written and published, not only in the United States, but there are British editions, Dutch, German. And this year, we're starting on the Japanese, with the first Japanese translation of The Art of Meditation. To watch how this message has spread without any organization, without any advertising, without any promotion, without any human footsteps. In all of these years, I have not gone to a city where I haven't been invited, meaning that there were students there before I arrived. And so, watching this unfoldment, it is a pleasure because it is so evident that this could only take place because of the fruitage of the message itself. And this, too, is an unusual experience because the principles of the infinite way are not simple to understand. They are far simpler to demonstrate than they are to grasp, to understand. In other words, it is possible to experience a great deal of harmony through this message without an understanding of why or how. The reason is that the power is in the principle, and the principle does the work. If I can explain that to you in this way, a principle must be revealed or must reveal itself from the inner plane, from inner consciousness, where it exists in its original form. You will understand that readily if you will think about wireless telegraphy or the radio or television or the automobile, airplane, and then remember that the principles of these always existed thousands of years ago. Every one of these principles existed somewhere, and that somewhere is in consciousness, in the invisible. But these have existed in your consciousness, in the consciousness of every individual on the face of the globe, awaiting someone to bring forth the particular principle. In other words, it did take an Edison or a Kettering or a Wright brothers or a Marconi to bring through their particular discoveries, but had they not done it, be assured of this, someone else would have done it, because the idea always existed in consciousness, and it had to come forth at a specific time. Emerson has said that nothing is so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And this is literally true, that every idea seems to have a particular time for coming through into the visible, and the idea itself projects itself. Usually there is an individual waiting for it, and is the instrument through whom it comes. But if that particular individual had not been there, another would have been. And so it is that the principles that constitute the message of the infinite way have existed throughout all time. Some of them, of course, are so universal in nature that they have existed even in human awareness throughout the centuries. In other words, they have been discovered, they have been practiced and taught, and then lost. And then another generation has come along, and someone has brought them through into visible expression, and again they were taught and practiced, and then lost again. And this has happened several times. The question always comes up, is it not possible that they will be lost again? And the answer is yes. There is always that possibility that anything that comes to light in human consciousness may be lost. There were great discoveries back in the days, 2,000 or 3,000 years BC, that are responsible for such engineering marvels as the pyramids, as some of the great temples that exist in many parts of the world, and no one to this day has been able to rediscover the principles that made it possible for them to be built. And so it is that any discovery can come to light and be lost. There is less likelihood now that these will be lost, because we have greater facilities for perpetuating them. In other words, we not only have printing presses that run off copies of these principles into the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, and we have all of these marvelous mechanics of today, tape recorders and records, and so there are greater ways of perpetuating them than ever before. And there is probably another factor. In previous generations, very little attention was paid to the developing of the spiritual consciousness of the men and women of the world. If you go back into ancient times, you will find that there was no spiritual development on the part of the people, with the exception of those who were led to the schools of wisdom, to the brotherhoods, to the religious organizations. those who left the ordinary world of living and retired into the religious ways or the ways of the brotherhoods, they developed their soul faculties, their spiritual consciousness, and the masses had none. As a matter of fact, some of these wisdoms were forbidden to the people, and those who knew the secrets were oath-bound to keep them from the people. The Master, Christ Jesus, was one of those who was under the promise, the oath, not to reveal certain spiritual principles to the people. They were to be known only to those of the brotherhood of which he was a member. But his own inner unfoldment would not permit his keeping these secrets from the people he loved. And he violated the laws of his order, undoubtedly left the body of that order, and went out to tell these secrets to the men and women of the world, the ordinary men and women, the fishermen, the housewives, the tax collectors, the farmers. It was for this reason that he was crucified. He was revealing the inner secrets that would make man free, secrets which were not supposed to be told to the men and women of this world. Well, there were not too many who understood him. There were some. We are told that actually there were about 500 who understood him well enough to perceive the nature of the resurrection. At least there were enough so that for the next 300 years, the inner secrets that he revealed remained on earth to be practiced and to be taught, and then gradually they disappeared from the earth again. Several times since then, they have been retaught to small groups here and there in the world, but each time they have managed to disappear. And one great reason is that these secrets cannot be understood by the human mind alone. It takes a developed spiritual capacity to understand them. And if one does not develop that spiritual capacity, the secret to them is virtually useless. In other words, it is not quite like a radio set that anyone may learn how to put it together and hook it up and bring music into their home. With spiritual truth, the truth itself is foolishness to the human mind. It always has been, and it always will be. It isn't reasonable, and there's no use of expecting it to be reasonable, because it won't be, it can't be, it never has been. The things of God are foolishness with man. And you will learn that the things of man are equally foolishness with God. That is the reason so few prayers are ever answered, because the things men pray for are just nonsensical in the sight of God, and they bring forth no response from God. So it is then that regardless of how many books may be in circulation that reveal truth, even books that may reveal all of the known truth, this is no sign that truth will be perpetuated. The only sign that we may have is if we find a sufficient dedication on the part of men and women to develop the necessary consciousness, the necessary spiritual faculties, so that truth may be understood, may be received, responded to, demonstrated, and thereby kept alive. Now, we have a question that has been given to us for answer that very well illustrates this very point. And the question is this. The Bible states, resist not evil. And the Bible also states, resist evil. Resist the devil. Matthew says that you resist not evil. And James says, resist the devil. And how do you bring these two things together? And of course you know the answer is you don't, and you can't. But you can note this. Who said, resist not evil? The answer is Jesus Christ. And then the next question is, did he prove that there is a principle of resist not evil? Did he prove that it is possible for him, and then for his disciples, and then for those who came for the next 300 years, to prove that you can live without resisting evil? And the answer is yes, he proved it. In his physical healings, he says to a crippled man, what did hinder you? Rise, pick up your bed and walk. He didn't resist the evil. He didn't pray to God to have the evil healed. He did not fight the evil. He didn't turn to any God power to do anything. He merely said, what did hinder you? Indicating that there is no power in this evil, therefore it need not be fought. Rise, pick up your bed and walk. To a blind man, he said, open thine eyes. Again, he did not appeal to God for any God power. He did not fight the devil. He did not resist the evil. Very quietly, very gently said, open thine eyes. And proved that there was no power to prevent that man opening his eyes. In another case of blindness, he took the most nothingness he could find, spittle, and he applied spittle to a blind man's eyes and healed him. Now, he wasn't claiming that spittle is a power that heals blindness. He was showing that something as innocuous as spittle was power enough. In other words, no power was needed. There was no evil behind this blindness. Therefore, open thine eyes. He raised the dead, and he did it in spite of his own statement that I need not pray. I need not pray to raise this dead man. Why? We don't need any God power to raise the dead. Death has no power, and therefore needs no power to overcome it. And so he said, Lazarus, come forth. So it was that in every demonstration that he made, stilling the storm at sea. No power, no acknowledgement of power, just peace, be still, and the storm subsided. Why? He acknowledged no power in the storm. Now, in this far that we've gone, you can see how foolishness all of this is to the human mind. To heal a blind man with spittle, to heal another blind man just by saying, "Open thine eyes," to have a crippled man get up and dance just by saying, "What did hinder you?" See how foolishness all of that is to the human mind? But it wasn't foolishness unto the Master, it wasn't foolishness unto his disciples, nor was it foolishness for the next 300 years. It only became foolish after that, when the secret was lost. Now, when you come to resist the devil, and you ask, who said that? You come to James. James said that. And who is he? He is one of the disciples that failed in his ministry. One of those who accomplished nothing. One of those who would not obey the teachings of the Master. One of those who could not come out of his Judaism to accept the principles of Christianity. Oh, he loved the man Jesus and he loved to follow him, but he wouldn't believe him. He was the one who fought against admitting Christians and pagans and Europeans into the brotherhood of Christianity. He was the one who fought Paul. Oh no, if a man is not circumcised, he can't be one of us. He must first be circumcised. He must first be a Jew. The Master said nothing like that. The Master just said, God is your Father and my Father. Call no man on earth your Father. There is but one in heaven. And so you see that this brother James has no record for healing works. He has no record for great works. And actually then, in this sense, he should not be considered. On the other hand, and this is an important message for many of our metaphysicians, regardless of which school of metaphysics they have come through. Too many go around saying there is no evil, or there is no power in evil, or disease has no power, or there is no truth to accidents. Too many make these metaphysical statements, usually cliches, without having the faintest consciousness of that truth, and thereby they make themselves ridiculous, they make metaphysics ridiculous, they make metaphysicians seem ridiculous in the eyes of the world. Too many of them have said even to doctors, oh, there's no power in sickness, we don't need doctors. Too many have taken stands in truth that they couldn't possibly demonstrate. To begin with, if they could demonstrate it, they wouldn't be so free with making those statements. Those who really understand, those who have attained the consciousness that evil is not a power, never voice it except when they are teaching or when they are treating. They would never think of making a statement of spiritual truth to a person who has no training or background in spiritual truth. It would be as ridiculous as for Albert Einstein to waste his time with me talking about relativity when I have no background for understanding the meaning. And so it is. The secret of spiritual living and spiritual demonstration is that there is but one power. Now mark this well. Since God is infinite and God is omnipotence, there can be no other power than God. Now it makes no difference what concept of God you have, because one thing you can be certain of, regardless of what your concept of God is, it isn't true and it isn't right and it isn't correct. It really represents only your concept and probably has no relationship at all to what God really is. But the point is this: whatever God is omnipotence, the all and the only power, or you have no God. You can't have a God divided against itself. You can't have a God made up of both good and evil. You can't have a God with limited power, because that takes it right out of the realm of God. The word God itself, or deity, has to mean that which is infinite, eternal, omnipresent, omnipotent. It has to mean that, or it isn't God. Therefore, when you come to what is truth, what is reality, the answer is omnipotence, omnipresence, omniscience, all wisdom, all or the only presence, and all power. Ah, yes, this is the spiritual truth. But this is not the truth of this world. This world, that which the Master said his kingdom was not of, this world, which the Master said he finally overcame, this world is made up of two powers. And some of our metaphysical friends who haven't gone far enough should learn this, that there are two powers in the human world, and these powers are both good and evil, and they are made up of material laws and forces and substances, and mental laws and forces and substance. And as long as you are living on the human plane of life, you are dealing with the two powers, good and evil, and in both material and mental forms. If anyone thinks otherwise, they'd better watch their own lives to see to what extent material laws and forces or mental laws and forces govern their lives. Now, these material and mental laws and forces and powers constitute what the Master called this world. And this was the world he overcame. And this was the world that he taught was to be overcome, and he taught the means of overcoming it. Now, he was accused of trying to overthrow the Roman government in the Holy Land. He was also accused of trying to overthrow the rule of the Hebrew synagogue and its hierarchy. But it never was true that he wanted to overthrow these. He wanted to reveal an area of consciousness, that which he called my kingdom, in which you would not be subject to Rome or to the hierarchy, even if you lived there. In other words, of the disciples, he said, I do not pray that you take them out of the world, leave them in the world, but not of it. And so it is that if you correctly understand spiritual truth, spiritual wisdom, you will understand this, that you can remain right here on earth, right where all of the epidemics of disease take place, where all of the accidents take place, all of the alcoholism and drug addiction takes place, where there are boom periods in business and bust periods in business. You can be right here on this earth and never be affected by them. In other words, you will have learned to live in the fourth dimension so that you can live a life on earth and yet be unaffected by the material and mental forces and powers that be. Now, this is exactly what is happening wherever spiritual healing takes place. Someone has come under a law of matter or of mind. It may be a law of infection or contagion. It may be a law of heredity. It may be a law of accident. It may be a law of some mental form of malpractice or mental belief. And yet, when they are brought into the consciousness of a spiritual healer, the laws that brought about their condition, whether material or mental, are dissolved, and they are restored and renewed. This is the experience, if you follow it, of individuals and families who for many years have lived under some metaphysical or spiritual teaching. And if you go back in their experience, more especially those where there is a history of 10 to 20 years of experience, and then try to determine how much less of this world's sins and diseases, how much less of this world's poverty has touched them, you will be astounded at what you find. You will be so astounded that you will wonder why all of the world has not brought itself into a metaphysical or spiritual atmosphere of life. And it really is a mystery. Don't think that it isn't a mystery to those who have witnessed what some of us have witnessed for 30 or more years. It's kind of fantastic to believe that there are people in the world who haven't even investigated it. But the point is this, that actually they can't. No one can successfully follow a metaphysical or spiritual teaching until in some measure they have been prepared for it. In other words, the average human being whose problems are not beyond human help have very little inclination to make the necessary devotion, consecration, sacrifice that is sometimes necessary to attain spiritual consciousness. Usually it is when our problems have reached such a degree that either, if it is disease, the doctor has said there is no hope, or even if he hasn't said it, the experience is proving that there is very little, or some other problem has come up of economics or family that becomes unendurable. And all of a sudden we find ourselves getting the notion, I've got to be healed even if it's through God. Yes, I can even take God if it's necessary. Might be hard, but I'll put up with it if it will do this for me. And those who are led to practitioners or teachers who can give them the help to bridge them over that temporary problem or temporary bad spot and guide them into studies, eventually they are the ones who blossom out into spiritual consciousness and find the value of living spiritually. Now, the easy thing in turning to a spiritual way of life is to learn the statements of truth and to repeat them. The difficult thing is to attain the actual consciousness necessary to the demonstration. So many times students write the same way or say the same thing. Well, I know all of these truths, but still nothing happens. Yes, many do know these truths, and it is true that nothing happens, because there is far more to spiritual living and demonstration than knowing the words. To begin with, it is actually necessary that we devote a period of time, thought, energy to a spiritual study. It is necessary that we practice certain principles as they apply to situations in our experience. And the great point is that gradually we have to learn to yield ourselves to the will of God instead of trying to mold God to our will. You see, for many centuries since 300 AD, prayer has mostly taken the form of trying to get God to do our will. Oh God, I need my rent on Saturday, and of course if you can have it there by Friday, I would prefer it. God, I want to be healed of this pain, or God, I want to get rid of this disease, or God, please save my neighbor, or God, please save my mother, or God. It is always an expectation that God is some kind of an exalted servant, but nevertheless a servant who is supposed to do our will. And if we decide that we want this little child down the street healed, then we expect God to do that for us. What the child may be doing, or the parents of the child, or the family of the child that may be interfering with God's plan, doesn't enter into our calculations. Just it is our will that this poor little sufferer be healed. And you'll notice how seldom God pays attention to our will or our wish. In the same way, we little dream of the fact that we ourselves are preventing the operation of God in our experience, that we ourselves are the barriers preventing spiritual law governing our experience. And it is only as we commence to realize that the function of God is not to glorify a human being. The function of God is not to set up a human race according to its own image and likeness, but rather the function of God is to operate in the kingdom of God, and the function of man, the human, is to bring himself back into that kingdom of God. Remember that the only human race there is a race of people who have separated themselves from the kingdom of God. Paul reveals this very clearly when he tells us that we are creatures who are not under the law of God, and neither indeed can be. That's why our prayers are not heard. We are not children of God. We are not creations of God. We are creatures who are not under the law of God, and neither indeed can be. And then he tells us how we may correct that. If so be the Spirit of God dwell in you, then do you become the children of God. And the Master made it a little more specific. He said that if you pray for your friends, it will profiteth you nothing, but if you pray for your enemies, it will make you a child of God. Of course, very few people pay attention to the Master. He doesn't seem to be considered much of an authority on how to become a child of God, because we find very few churches keeping their doors open for the specific purpose of praying for our enemies so that we may become the children of God. But you see how simple it would be to become a child of God. Learn to pray for your enemies and watch the miracle that takes place. But no, we decide we like our own way best. And our own way is to pray for our friends, and pray for the neighbor who lives down the street, and pray for our parents, and pray for our children, in spite of the fact that it profiteth you nothing. Whereas we could give up our own will, we could accept the teaching of the Master and say, well, at least it's worth a try. They're still quoting him after 2,000 years. Maybe he's worth trying. And then we would find that it literally is true, that from the moment we start praying for our enemies, our own problems begin to dissolve and disappear. From that moment on, we begin to find a whole new state of consciousness unfolding within ourselves. You would be surprised that you couldn't be the person that you are at this minute, 30 days after you started praying daily for your enemies. It changes your entire nature and brings you into an atmosphere receptive to God's presence. God's presence cannot be felt or known where there is animosity, jealousy, hate, envy, bigotry, bias. God's presence is there because God fills all space. God literally is omnipresent. As a matter of fact, God is present every time a murder takes place. God is present every time a war takes place and all the horrors of the battlefield. God fills every space there. God is omnipresent where rapes take place. You wouldn't believe that, would you? But it's true. The only reason God isn't in evidence is God isn't being realized. God is present, but not realized. It operates just exactly as if you had $1 million in a bank somewhere, but didn't know you had it. You could be just as hungry with $1 million in the bank as with nothing, unless you knew you had that money. And so it is that we are totally without God. Every human being in the world is totally without God. until they become consciously aware of God's presence. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee. Acknowledge him in all thy ways, from getting up in the morning until retiring at night, and he will give thee peace. And the Master tells us in 15th John, if you abide in me, if you let me abide in you, you will bear fruit richly. If you do not, in spite of my omnipresence, you will be as a branch of a tree that is cut off and withereth. And so, the whole secret of spiritual living isn't begging God to do something. It isn't pleading with God to do anything. It isn't asking God to do anything. It isn't trying to get God to improve our humanhood. The whole secret of spiritual living is in obeying the will of God, acknowledging God, recognizing God in the midst of me, living, moving, and having our being consciously in God, keeping the mind stayed on God, praying for our enemies, praying for those who persecute us, praying for those who despitefully use us, and forgiving 70 times 7. You see, none of this has anything to do with asking God to heal the blind man or the impotent man, and you don't have to pray to God. You have to be in obedience to the will of God, and then these miracles take place through your consciousness. Be assured of this: no practitioner of spiritual work, and no teacher of spiritual work could be very successful in their work if they were living humanly, if they are still holding to human values, holding to unforgiveness, lack of forgiveness, lack of understanding, if they were praying merely for their own or for those of their own spiritual household. This is so evident also in the Master's statement, love thy neighbor as thyself. And too often students interpret this to mean to love those of their own spiritual or religious persuasion. And therefore, they may tithe their income, and they may tithe it with their particular church. They may even tithe it with their particular philanthropy. But they forget all about their neighbors, and more especially about their enemy neighbors. And this is not loving thy neighbor as thyself. And there too a miracle takes place in the experience of an individual when they first of all decide to set aside of the first fruits that come from God, not what's left over at the end of the month, but a certain specific amount of the first fruits, and then begin to divide it, not only with those who please them, not only with those with whom they agree, but with all of their neighbors who may be in some temporary form of lack or limitation. So it is, you see, that the spiritual life, which is one lived in prayer, has no relationship at all to the type of prayer that is asking God for something, for anybody. It is a type of prayer which is an acknowledgement of God's grace, of God's presence, of God's power, an acknowledgement of the universal nature of God's love. And then it is a putting into practice of those principles which great spiritual masters have revealed. Those of forgiveness, those of praying for the enemy, not that they be successful in their wickedness, but that their spiritual eye be opened, that their heart and soul be opened to the reign of divine government, to truth, to spiritual life, to the activity of the Christ. So, as we then, by these different means, spiritualize our own consciousness, it gradually dawns within us that, well, experience shows us that the power of God is really the only power. We begin to witness in our own experience that those things which formerly had power over us no longer have such power. They may not cease entirely, but they decrease. It may be in what we eat or what we drink, or the amounts. It may be in our attitude toward members of our family, business, community. In other words, we begin to be changed. And as this change takes place within us, we learn to fear less what mortal man can do to me. We learn to fear less what mortal conditions can do to me. We learn to fear less the things and the thoughts that are of this world, because now a greater response is felt, a greater confidence in the invisible. Here is where the great transition takes place. That whereas before we loved, we feared, and we hated in the human or animal or vegetable or mineral kingdoms, now these loves, hates, and fears begin to disappear, and we begin to love in the invisible realm, and we find things to love. It changes our consciousness. I would like to point this out to you, because this indicates one of the ways in which our consciousness changes, and another miracle comes into our life, the miracle of supply. In our humanhood, we look out, let us say, on the fruit trees, and we see the fruit there, and we rejoice in the abundance, the presence of that which appears to be supply. In the same way, we are apt to look at our pocketbooks, our bank accounts when they are filled or nearly so, and rejoice also, taking it as evidence that here too is abundance. It is visible, it is tangible, and we see it so. We are apt to look out at the beautiful scenery in the spring and in the summer, in some places in the autumn, and here too we revel in this beauty because it is visible and tangible. And so it is that our lives are lived primarily in the external, and we value that which is visible, that which is tangible, and in the absence of it, we begin to be sad, and in some cases, we begin to fear. Now, when you look at your fruit trees or your flower garden in the winter, you don't fear, because your experience has taught you that as soon as spring comes around again, there will be visible evidences of supply, and when summer comes, it will be tangible. And so this sight of barrenness in the winter does not faze you, does not disturb you. You look upon it as normal and natural, knowing, remember, that behind that barrenness there is a law operating, a law of nature, and that in due time the abundance will appear again. Now, through your spiritual studies and practice, you begin to perceive that this is a law of God, and that it is applicable not only to your gardens, your orchards. This is true to every phase of life. No matter how barren your life may be, whether of supply or of health, and if enough years have passed by over your head so that you may even feel barren of many more years, stop for a moment and reflect on this. There is an invisible life, an invisible law, an invisible presence, an invisible power. And it is functioning right now. It is functioning as a law of resurrection. It is functioning as a law of nature. It is functioning as a law of restoration. In other words, any momentary barrenness, regardless of what may have brought it about, is only temporary in the experience of those who can look through the appearance and realize there is an infinite invisible. Here where I am, God is. Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. Eternally, unto the end of the world I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Unto the end of the world I will be with you. This invisible presence, this invisible power, this transcendental being we call God, which is closer to you than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, this will never leave you nor forsake you, and in its due season it will appear as fruitage if you continue to bear witness to this word, if you abide in this word, if you let this word abide in you. Don't forget, if you don't, you will be as a branch of a tree that is cut off and withereth. There is no lack of health or supply. There is a lack of our acknowledgement of the presence of the infinite invisible. There is a lack of continuity in our realization that there are 4 dimensions of life, not 3. And the 4th dimension is the real one, because, as Paul rightly said, everything that's visible is produced by that which is invisible. There is nothing in this visible universe that did not have its origin in the invisible. Therefore, if there is no visibility today, don't fear. There is an invisibility producing, creating, unfolding, and it will come into our line of vision as we abide in the secret place of the Most High. In other words, as we abide in this consciousness of omnipresence and omnipotence. If, however, you yield to temptation and believe that there is a power that can separate you from your good, then you suffer from your belief. You never suffer from God or the absence of God. You suffer from your own belief that God is absent, or that for some reason God's grace is withheld from you. And of course, the greatest sin in all the world is the belief that many people have that God is punishing them for their sins, and therefore they have this disease, this lack, this limitation, this unhappy experience, when God is entirely innocent. God never has been responsible for the ill of any human being who ever existed on the face of the globe. And as a proof of this, the Master revealed to us that he was doing the will of God in healing the sick, in raising the dead, in forgiving the sinners. In other words, in revealing to us that God has nothing to do with our lacks or limitations, our sins or our diseases. In fact, it is God's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. And God has said to the woman taken in adultery, neither do I condemn thee. And to the thief on the cross, neither do I condemn thee. I will take thee into paradise this very night. And so you see that the human mind is looking for ways and means of throwing God out of their lives, and looking for excuses why God isn't in their lives, when actually there is only one reason for our discords. And that reason is that we are not living in a continuous consciousness of the presence of an invisible omnipotence, closer to us than breathing, so close to us that if we go to heaven it will be there, and if we go to hell it will be there, and if we walk through the valley of the shadow of death it will be there. In other words, God is inseparable and indivisible from our being, and it requires only our continued acknowledgement of this for days, weeks, months, in spite of contrary appearances, until it becomes visible. And now we're going to have a brief period of rest, relaxing, until we return again for an hour.